All right, now get this. A major biblical find has been made in Israel yet again, but this time it has to do with the prophet Isaiah. Israeli archaeologists believe they have unearthed a seal from the 8th century BCE that was created by the hand of the prophet himself. And if it truly was his, it may be the first ever proof of his existence.
Fighters from the Sunni extremist group, the Islamic State, formerly known as ISIS, have blown up a well-known shrine in the northern Iraqi city of Mosul. Local officials say the jihadis have damaged 30 shrines in and around Mosul since they overran the territory. But last month, the militants proclaimed a caliphate spanning parts of Iraq and Syria. But they say they have now taken over a large Syrian army.
The seal was discovered in the remains of the first temple near Jerusalem's Temple Mount. The minuscule artifact was found near the southern wall of the holy complex, and the clay impression is inscribed with letters and what appears to be a grazing doe, which apparently is a sign of blessing and protection that was typically found in Judah. The oval-shaped seal sadly isn't intact, but on its legible portion, there's an inscription with First Temple Hebrew letters that seem to spell out the name Le'eshayu, in other words, belonging to Isaiah. On just one line below, there is also the partial word Nevi, N-V-Y, which is believed to spell out prophet. Put two and two together, and we have the prophet Isaiah. Prophet Isaiah is perhaps the most well-known biblical prophet, and he's known to have been active around the late 8th century and early 7th century BCE. This seal was discovered only 10 feet away from where the same archaeological team discovered a completely intact seal with the inscription of King of Hezekiah of Judah back in 2015.
This is a really interesting story. I mean, how an American billionaire can pay people hundreds of thousands of dollars to try to attack you and other people who object to Islamic terrorism. I mean, that's the crux of the story. And then that very same person involved in that and delegitimizing Israel is one of the biggest funders of the Democratic Party. That's huge. That's a huge story.
And I think that members of the more liberal and more progressive press ought to be answering why this isn't newsworthy, why only certain things are newsworthy, and why somebody far to the left and further to the left than they are, why they won't investigate, report, cover, and talk about these things.
Where is this?
And where is it? I don't think you're going to see it in tomorrow's papers.
As you may know, the 85-year-old billionaire is a far-left fanatic whose Open Society organization advocates no borders anywhere in the world. According to Soros, everyone should be able to go wherever they want for any reason and stay there.
There's even evidence to show that he looks upon the refugee crisis in Europe, and it's a terrible crisis, as an opportunity for him to further his ideas and his policies. And as you pointed out, in a Middle East that is melting down, where you have genocide taking place among Christian, Yazidi, and other communities, what he's doing is targeting the one open society in the whole region, and that's Israel. And it's particularly ironic that as he's pursuing what is a kind of McCarthyism, he is the founder of the Open Societies Foundation. How does an open society foundation try to shut down debate, try to demonize and delegitimize Israel?
Recently, hackers believed to be backed by Russia exposed more than 2,000 documents connected to Soros and his Open Society. The information very disturbing. Soros has given about $10 million to groups opposed to the policies of Israel. He has funded individuals accusing Israel of war crimes. He has given a variety of grants to people who literally hate the Jewish state of Israel.
This has been one of the sources of the hostility that exists in the Muslim world towards Israel. In a sense, it kind of drives them crazy. It was Ezekiel back in chapter 25 of his prophecy who called it an ancient hostility. In fact, the phrase ancient hostility in the original language literally means a revengeful, vengeance, malice, a never-ending enmity. So that when you discuss that across borders sometimes, it's unbelievable. They hate the Israelis many times far more than progressives hate Trump. You know, it's like watching CNN or something. It's just like you just see people raging and raving and anger, and it's not even something that you can even have a conversation about. It's just an angry hostility. And, you know, one can't help but say, well, why? And you hear all these accusations, very few of them that are historically valid. It was undeniable that the Jews have held an inexplicable place in human history. It was Mark Twain back in 1879 or 1897 who said, if the statistics are right, the Jews constitute about 1/4% of the human race. Today, they represent even less, 0.2%, 0.2% of the human race are people of Jewish descent. He says, properly, the Jew ought to be hardly heard of, yet his importance is extravagantly out of proportion to the smallness of his bulk. His contributions to the world's list of great names in literature, science, art, music, finance, medicine, and abstruse learning are also very out of proportion to the weakness of his numbers. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Persians rose. They filled the planet with sound and splendor, and then faded and passed away. The Greeks and the Romans followed. The Jews saw them all, survived them all, and is now, when he always was, exhibiting no weakening of his parts, slowing of his energies, dulling of his alert, aggressive mind. All other forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality?
We meet this month as regional tensions are taking an increasingly perilous turn. Fighting in Syria is increasing, endangering de-escalation arrangements and regional stability, as well as undermining efforts for a political solution.
We turn now to Syria in the civil war that has lasted 7 years. Some of the worst acts of violence have come in the last 48 hours.
After an assault that is both total and pitiless by President Bashar al-Assad's regime on a rebel-held suburb of Damascus.
Despite the positive news from Iraq and the defeat of Daesh, much of the Middle East continues to be in the grips of an ongoing human tragedy of immense proportion. Mr. President, against this backdrop, and after over a century of hostilities, including 50 years of continued military occupation, Israelis and Palestinians are still no closer to peace. Many have lost hope that they will see it in their lifetimes.
This context underscores the need for a political solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has lasted for far too long. Yet we must face today's sad reality. After decades of support, the global consensus for a two-state solution could be eroding.
But when the UN said we need to declare this as a separate state within separate borders, suddenly it gave rise to armed conflicts, that 200 million Arabs rose up in arms against 200,000 Israelis. And we've seen ever since, from the Palestinians to Hamas to Hezbollah to Islamic Jihad, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Turkey, Iran, Yemen, Somalia, and the list goes on and on and on. There has been an increasing, intensified hatred. And we understand, we sit there and say, why can't you guys just get along? And the answer is religious. It's not anything else.
Mr. President, the security situation on the Golan is also a growing concern. A worrying escalation occurred on February the 10th when Israeli defense forces destroyed what they identified as an Iranian unmanned aerial vehicle, which had reportedly entered its airspace from Syria.
Israel accuses Iran of using a base inside Syria to launch the drone.
Shortly thereafter, Israeli aircraft targeted a Syrian airbase. During the attack, one Israeli jet was hit, injuring 2 pilots
knocking an Israeli jet out of the sky for the first time in 36 years.
As the peace process falters and the gulf between the two sides widens, Palestinians and Israelis continue to suffer the violent consequences on the ground. And lastly, it is critical that any future peace proposal focus on the two-state solution and all final status issues as per prior agreements and relevant UN resolutions. A failure to do so could have dangerous repercussions.
Ezekiel agrees with this. In fact, he says a storm is coming. So that those of you who are hoping that somehow there will be peace in the Middle East, it's impossible. As one of my Israeli friends said to me, you know, when the socialists were running the Palestinian Authority, he said there was a hope of peace. But now that the religionists have taken over, the Islamists, he says there's absolutely no hope of peace, because now it has become a theological issue. Do you know that right now that Israel has uncovered the largest deposit of natural gas in the world? And they are drilling it so that very soon Israel will be completely energy self-sufficient. Arafat used to say, well, we'll drive them into the sea and let them drink seawater. How true that was. It was a prophecy, because today 80% of Israel's water is drawn from the Mediterranean Ocean. It's desalinated, desalted water, because the Israelis developed a system for desalination that's clean and pure. They use solar power instead of coal power, as is done in most places, and oil power in most places in the world. Clean, efficient. And suddenly they were, after being dependent upon rainfall and the Jordan River and the Sea of Galilee, now 80% of the water comes out of the ocean. So Arafat was right. He said, let them drink salt water. They are.
We've been reporting about a lot of tension on Israel's northern and southern fronts, but now we surprisingly have some good news about one of our neighboring countries. Israel's Delek Drilling and America's Noble Energy have just announced a historic $15 billion deal that will provide natural gas to Egypt. The two energy conglomerates are expected to supply around 64 billion cubic meters of natural gas to Egypt over the next 10 years. And as a result, Israel will now become one of Egypt's main natural gas providers. That's a big deal because Egypt is the Arab world's most populated country. The deal with Egypt follows a smaller one that Israel made with Jordan in 2016, which means Israel will now be providing natural gas to both of its Arab allies in the region.
But again, you have to understand that Israel is one of the most wealthy and powerful countries. Their natural resources are beyond control. So that when you go into a restaurant in Europe and you're eating fine, beautiful spices and beautiful herbs, they're grown that day in Tel Aviv or in Israel and flown to Europe every day. Fresh tomatoes, oranges, and so forth. It's pretty amazing to see what they have actually. Even as Isaiah prophet said, the desert will bloom. When you drive through the desert today, you know what you see in Israel? Greenhouses. Greenhouses, and every day in the restaurant or the hotels you sit down to fresh fruits and vegetables that were picked that day and delivered to your table. And it just blossoms. Well, I could go on and on about that side of it.
Israel has a population of less than 8 million, but it's one of the top performers on the Nasdaq Tech Stocks Index. It has the highest investment in R&D anywhere in the world, proportional to the size of its economy. This is linked to a strong military base and a young population.
There are over 5,000 startups in Israel spread between Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Beersheba, and the north of the country.
It's interesting because even as The Economist noted recently, it said in the span of just a few decades, The Jewish state has transformed itself from a backwater into a high-tech superpower. In other words, they have more high-tech startups per capita than any other country in the world. The new iPhone was developed in Israel, just a few miles in Netanya, right just up north of Tel Aviv. And they create more new tech startups that are being bought up by the large technical companies every day.
"20 Israeli startup companies are set to compete for the right to travel to Shenzhen, China for an international competition.
From Silicon Valley to Silicon Wadi, Israel is a growing presence in the tech market, with tech representing 75% of the country's industrial production.
And indisputably, Israel is today one of the richest, one of the most powerful countries in the region, so that even though it's a country of only 6 million people, the Israeli shekel is traded on the world money market exchange with only a half dozen other currencies, like the US dollar or the Chinese renminbi or even the Russian ruble. But here we have the shekel coming from this little tiny country, which is part of the economic trading system for money traders around the world. One of the most powerful and strongest currencies in the world. It's kind of amazing, and even in terms of their military power, their military is registered as the 11th strongest military in the world. And clearly the most powerful military in the whole Middle Eastern and Mediterranean region. It's greater than Britain. Their army is strong, higher rated than France or any of those countries that once were the great powers. Of all those countries where you have Russia and the United States and China, and not far behind them is this little tiny country of only 6.5 million people with one of the strongest and most efficient militaries in the world. In fact, when they buy our F-16s, and now looking at they're buying the F-35s, they ask the U.S. to send them to them stripped of their technology because their technology and the avionics are so far superior to what we create and more adapted to their particular regional needs. So that when we think about missile defense systems, who do we partner with to develop them?
Do you see China as a place where this type of digital dictatorship is most likely to emerge?
Well, I don't know. As I said, as I gave examples, you have cases in the West. And I know maybe best about my own country, that Israel is building a real total surveillance regime in the West Bank, which is something we haven't seen anywhere, almost anywhere in history before, of really trying to follow every place, every individual. And we still haven't crossed the critical watershed of the biometric sensor. Whether it's in the US, in Israel, in China, it's still social media. It's still my mobile phone. It's still where I go, what use I make of my credit card. We still don't really have the technology to go inside, but we are maybe 5 years, 10 years away from having the technology. So maybe to give an extreme example, let's say you live in North Korea, and you have to wear this bracelet, which constantly monitors what is happening inside your body. And you walk into a room and you see the picture of the dear leader on the wall, and the bracelet can know what is happening to your brain, to your blood pressure, as you see this picture. So this really what is meant by a digital dictatorship.
I mean, it makes 1984 sound positively...
Child's play.
Child's play,
yeah.
Exactly.
Although most of the Old Testament prophecies about the last days or the end times, whichever you prefer, speak primarily about Israel and those events surrounding them as a nation in the end times, and particularly the city of Jerusalem, because we often say that Israel and Jerusalem are God's timepiece for the last times. But the book of Daniel is noticeably different in that through a series of very picturesque visions, it views the future through both an international and what we would call a geopolitical lens. It talks about the interface and the interaction of kings and kingdoms and great geographical strata of the earth. We find that the word that Daniel uses repeatedly in chapter 7 in describing it is that it was different. In verse 19 of chapter 7, he says, it was different from all others, exceedingly dreadful, its teeth of iron and nails of bronze, which devour and broke in pieces and trampled the residue with its feet. Then further on, in verse 23, he says, it will be different from all other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. And yet we find that because of this fourth kingdom, which really comes out of Rome but is really different from Rome, it's led to all sorts of speculative ideas as to who this really is. Attempts to identify this final terrible kingdom that will rule not just a region, but will rule over the entire world and do it with such ferocity and such force.
Now, how exactly will the future masters of the planet look like? This will be decided by the people who own the data. Those who control the data control the future not just of humanity, but the future of life itself. Because today, data is the most important asset in the world. In ancient times, land was the most important asset. And if too much land became concentrated in too few hands, humanity split into aristocrats and commoners. Then in the modern age, in the last 2 centuries, machinery replaced land as the most important asset. And if too many of the machines became concentrated in too few hands, humanity split into classes, into capitalists and proletariats. Now data is replacing machinery as the most important asset. So who should own the data? I frankly don't know. I think the discussion has just begun. Most people, when they hear the talk about regulating data, they think about privacy, about shopping, about companies, corporations that know where I go and what I buy. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are much more important things at stake.
And the question is, what kind of form will this take? Because again, think about how Daniel described this last world empire. That first of all, he said it would be global in its authority. He was given authority over every tribe, every people, every language, every nation. It's a universal authority, a global authority. But secondly, again, he said that he would be different from all other kingdoms. In other words, we can't look at a prototype from history and say, well, it's this kind of system or it's that kind of system. What he is going to formulate is a kind of governmental system that has never been seen on the earth before.
Until today, nobody had the necessary computing power and the necessary data to hack humanity. Even if the Soviet KGB or the Spanish Inquisition followed you around everywhere, 24 hours a day, watching everything you do, listening to everything you say, still, they didn't have the computing power and the biological knowledge necessary to make sense of what was happening inside your body and brain and to understand how you feel and what you think and what you want. But this is now changing because of 2 simultaneous revolutions. On the one hand, advances in computer science, and especially the rise of machine learning and AI, are giving us the necessary computing power. And at the same time, advances in biology. But control of data might enable human elites to do something even more radical than just build digital dictatorships. By hacking organisms, elites may gain the power to re-engineer the future of life itself. Because once you can hack something, you can usually also engineer it. And if indeed we succeed in hacking and engineering life, this will be not just the greatest revolution in the history of humanity. This will be the greatest revolution in biology since the very beginning of life 4 billion years ago. For 4 billion years, nothing fundamental changed in the basic rules of the game of life. All of life, for 4 billion years, dinosaurs, amoebas, tomatoes, humans, all of life was subject to the laws of natural selection and to the laws of organic biochemistry. But this is now about to change. Science is replacing evolution by natural selection with evolution by intelligent design. Not the intelligent design of some god above the clouds, but our intelligent design and the intelligent design of our clouds, the IBM cloud, the Microsoft cloud. These are the new driving forces of evolution.
But until recently, you have to keep in mind that the whole idea of this universal economic system seemed completely undoable, and for obvious reasons. How could you maintain that kind of control and quality worldwide? But as Daniel prophesied some 2,600 years ago in the end of his prophecy, he told us in Daniel 12:4 that at the time of the end, he said, knowledge would increase. For the last 40 years alone, technological knowledge alone has literally skyrocketed to the point that sociologists refer to it as a data deluge, kind of like an informational tsunami. And you see the chart just over the last 40 years, they broke it down into bits of information, and how over the last just few years it has just gone straight up and continues to go up at such an exponential rate that we are at a place now that no one can understand all of the information that is now available. It was quite interesting when Google was experimenting with a couple of artificial intelligence computers, and they set them up to begin to teach each other and communicate information, and wrote an algorithm that would enable the machines to educate themselves without having input of data from programmers. And it was so successful that early on they began to create their own language, that they communicated in this own unique language between themselves that nobody could understand, and at that point they decided maybe we ought to pull the plug.
Now, why is data so important? It's important because we've reached the point when we can hack not just computers, we can hack human beings and other organisms. There is a lot of talk these days about hacking computers and email accounts and bank accounts and mobile phones. But actually, we are gaining the ability to hack human beings. Now, what do you need in order to hack a human being? You need two things. You need a lot of computing power, and you need a lot of data, especially biometric data. Not data about what I buy or where I go, but data about what is happening inside my body and inside my brain. And at the same time, advances in biology, and especially in brain science, are giving us the necessary understanding, biological understanding. You can really summarize 150 years of biological research since Charles Darwin in 3 words. Organisms are algorithms. This is the big insight of the modern life sciences. That organisms, whether viruses or bananas or humans, they are really just biochemical algorithms. And we are learning how to decipher these algorithms.
There are so many things that are coming to pass, as I said before, that are so close to what the Bible describes that I'm kind of stunned by what I'm reading in the world around me. So that one thing that we all can agree on is that from the beginning of biblical history, you go back to Genesis chapter 11, following the flood, If we begin with Nimrod and the building of the Tower of Babel, there has been a long list of maniacal megalomaniacs who have tried and failed to create a global empire centered on worship of themselves. So that even up to in most recent history, whether we're talking about people like Genghis Khan or Adolf Hitler, it really is really easy to see how that there has been this passion and this drive to own and control and to rule over the entirety of the world. And in some ways, even jihadist Islam is focused upon that idea of conquering and controlling the world with one caliph who will rule over everything. And I would suggest to you that that is an antichrist spirit and not just simply a different religious point of view. So that what I want to really say is this kind of spirit of Antichrist that the Bible talks about has been operational since the fall in the garden.
And once you have enough such biometric information and enough computing power, you can create algorithms that know me better than I know myself. And humans really don't know themselves very well. This is why algorithms have a real chance of getting to know ourselves better. We don't really know ourselves because unlike land and unlike machinery, data is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It can move at the speed of light, and you can create as many copies of it as you want.
So that undoubtedly, whether we're talking about Hitler or Genghis Khan or Attila the Hun or whoever you want to point out through human history, they've all been basically inspired by Satan, and they all have failed because, as we just read in verse 6, the one who now holds back will continue to do so until he is taken out of the way. Now, the phrase holds back is actually one word in the original. It means the restrainer, the one who hinders. And he keeps something from being able to progress. So that what he's telling us is, from earliest times, Satan has been trying to bring to pass his plan of establishing his dominion and his rule through his demonically possessed leader to control humanity and set up one world kingdom, one world government under satanic power and a control. That's the agenda. That's Satan's desire. That's really what he's working towards. And I would suggest to you that it's not just something that we see happening in our present time, but it's been underway since the beginning of time. When one approaches biblical prophecy in a literal way, I mean a literal reading of the Bible, that not engaging in, allegorical guessing and figuring, but really just reading it as it's written, one of the things that becomes really abundantly clear is that Israel and Jerusalem in particular play a very important role, a special role in terms of what we talk about as the end times, God's future plans for the world. Even the Apostle Paul felt it was important, so important, that he explained in his letter to the Romans that God had a special covenant relationship with Israel. But from the beginning, God defined his relationship with the Jewish people as being a special and unique one. And that really got lost within Christian theology, especially around the 5th century when Augustine came up with his city of God concept and the idea that the church has subsumed the role of Israel, and now the church is the new Israel, and the old Israel is gone and forgotten, as if God terminated his covenants to them. And in doing that, you have to overlook some of the very specific wording that God uses in terms of his relationship with the people of Israel. He says, for example, in chapter 26 of Deuteronomy, he says, the Lord has declared this day that you are his people, his treasured possession, his allotted inheritance. You are the apple of his eye. To Abraham, he further goes on to say that this commitment is an unconditional, everlasting covenant relationship in which he promises both to bless them in material ways and population. From a historical perspective, Israel is an anomaly. We might call them an outlier. They have no comparison. There's no other group who, after being dispersed, ever came back and re-inhabited the lands of their forefathers. This has never happened. We can't find any place in history where anybody has ever done this. A land which Ezekiel even once said has been long desolate. And why, when Israel miraculously became a nation again in 1948. In fact, it's interesting how Isaiah makes this statement, Isaiah 66:8. He says, "Can a country be born in a day, or a nation be brought forth in a moment? Yet no sooner is Zion in labor that she gives birth to her children." And so one of the things that we see happened is chronicled by the next slide, is on May 14th, 1948, the United Nations in one day declared that Israel now was a nation. An almost unanimous vote, except for the Arab countries at the time, declaring that Israel should be a state and have a place to live within the Promised Land. And then we find at the result of the Six-Day War, after that Jerusalem was retaken by the Israelites in June of 1967. And that's when a lot of prophecy students began to take very, very close attention. Because you see, for years, as I said, people took an allegorical view, because they said basically the Jewish people are destroyed and dispersed. They will never rebuild a nation. They will never be back in Jerusalem. And they certainly never will ever be able to build a temple. And then all of a sudden, 2 of 3 come to pass within a very few decades. That the nation is rebuilt, they retake Jerusalem, and the only thing that's left outstanding is the rebuilding of the temple, which actually is something that happens as a consequence of the battle that we're going to study, I believe, and results of the Antichrist coming to power, that he actually will work with the Jews in the rebuilding of a third temple on which he places his image and commands the world to worship him. And this opens up the door for the Antichrist. In fact, Daniel tells us, and I think it happens as a consequence of this, that the Antichrist will suddenly confirm a covenant with Israel for 7 years. The 7 years of the tribulation. In other words, he'll basically agree with them for the rebuilding of the temple. And there's debates about where the temple will be built. But essentially, as this fictional portrait illustrates, the idea that where the Dome of Rock once stood will be erected a temple for the worship of the God of Israel, that Israel will have this spiritual revival, that their God is real, he's alive. But then he adds, he says, in the middle of the 7, that means at the 3.5-year point, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. In other words, stop the service of the temple. And on the wings of the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. Jesus in Matthew 24, and later on in the book of Revelation, we're told exactly what happens. Paul describes it. He says it again in chapter 2 of Thessalonians. The man of lawlessness, when he is revealed, he will oppose and exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worship, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. Proclaiming himself to be God. It's interesting to me. I mean, maybe it's sheer coincidence, but one of the things that God said to Abraham back in Genesis chapter 12 is, and it's kind of a warning, a promise and a warning to the rest of the world. He said, I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. Let me go out on a very thin, scary political limb here. And I'm not saying this in terms of an endorsement of our current president, but just something occurred to me, and you can take it for what it's worth. Since November, I should say through November and December, I would say that our current president has been ferociously embattled I mean, it's like you just, even John Kerry is quoted now of having talked to the Palestinians and told them, don't worry, he won't be around in a year. And there's a lot of that conversation. He's going to be impeached and, so forth and so on. That Maxine Water only has one phrase, and that's impeach, 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 impeach. So, most of us, if you've paid any attention to the news, you've thought, and I thought to myself, how long could this guy endure this? Everything he wanted, he tried to replace and repeal Obamacare. Republicans all, the whole thing is you just think the toilet needs flushing, I don't know what. You just look at the whole thing and go, this is such crazy and chaos, and this is going to be, the government's going to be deadlocked, and nothing's going to get accomplished, and we're not going to move forward. And then all of a sudden, he does something that nobody saw coming. He comes out and says, we're recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And we're going to begin the process of building our embassy in Jerusalem. Wow. And I went back and I said, what was the date of that? And I began to look at what has happened since then. Suddenly the tax bill goes through. Suddenly we find that all sorts of information about what's going on in the dark state is just percolating to the surface, and we're realizing that it looks very likely, like many of our law enforcement agencies, at least the leadership, is corrupt. We began to find out that now they're beginning to run for cover as they're being exposed. The Mueller investigation is probably going to fizzle out because it was based upon a false premise, a fraudulent document. I look at the economy is soaring, the tax bill was passed, the shutdown was shut down, and now DACA and the border wall and all those things are probably going to be happening. And I'm sitting there going, his whole agenda's kind of suddenly come alive and is kind of going across his enemies like a steamroller. And I thought, well, what is it possible that because he has blessed Israel, that God is blessing the U.S., blessing him at least? Now, you know me, I would never take sides in a political debate. I'll be honest, the man frequently troubles me. Frequently troubles me. I'm glad he lives in Washington and not next door. But I just find it interesting. Cyrus, who liberated Israel, or the Jews, from captivity, was not a nice guy. But God names him in Isaiah and says, I will use you. And God will use anybody, I believe, who will bless the church, who will bless Israel. God says, if they bless you, I'll bless them. So I don't think it's necessarily a magical formula. I don't think that suddenly he's become a nice guy. I mean, I really don't even want to pass judgment on him because I don't know who he is. And I may try to borrow some money from him someday. But the point is, it's just an interesting point. Just a thought.